Hello and welcome to the Metropolitan Museum of Art's virtual drop-in drawing session. In this program, we bring the Met to you with a series of drawing exercises based on works in our collection meant to challenge and grow your creative skills. My name is Jacqueline Cedar and I am an artist and educator at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. I focus primarily on drawing and painting in my own practice, and in the past year I have been independently curating exhibitions with a wide range of media. Typically, I lead art making sessions on site at the museum inspired by works in our collection, and today I'm joining you from my home and studio in Brooklyn, New York. Today we'll be learning about scale, composition, and light in landscapes, and we'll be using Greco's View of Toledo as a starting point as we develop depth and perspective in our own drawn or painted landscapes inspired by this artwork. Please feel free to follow along with the demonstration and create as you watch, or come back to these ideas on your own time after watching the video. Either way, we're hoping you'll think of this session as the beginning of an exploration into El Greco's painting and process. Let's take a closer look at the painting together. El Greco's View of Toledo is approximately 4 feet tall by 3.5 feet wide and depicts his impression of Toledo at the end of the 16th century. El Greco, the Greek in Spanish, grew up in Crete, Greece, but spent most of his life in Toledo, Spain. The painting has been referred to as more of a spiritual or symbolic portrait of this place, as El Greco took liberties in rearranging the architecture situated on the hill overlooking the Roman bridge. The painting describes a complex and sweeping view of a city perched high on a hill, seen from the perspective of a viewer standing in a valley below the hill. The painting is packed with deep blues and lush greens as El Greco renders an undulating view from a small hill looking down and then up at winding paths that guide our eyes toward the top of the painting. Tall rectangular buildings float and twist through green hills and organic tree forms in a style similar to El Greco's characteristically elongated figurative work. Large, looming, stormy, clouded skies open to a small patch of blue, a space that ultimately pulls us into the overall depth of the landscape. In 1908, Rilke wrote an impassioned letter to Rodin just after returning from the salon where he spent an hour observing this painting by El Greco. He began, "The storm has struck and falls briskly behind a city that, on the slope of a hill, rises in haste toward its cathedral, and higher up, its fortress, square and massive. A splintered light tills the ground, turning it over, tearing into it, and bringing up here and there pale green meadows behind the trees, standing like insomniacs. Looking first at the overall scene, my eyes move from bottom to top of the canvas. In the foreground, there are green trees and grassy hillsides, and a stream that weaves through the hills. In the bottom 1/3 of the painting, as the hills start to rise towards the city, a bridge crosses the river. The bridge leads to a road that is houses and other architecture as it climbs into the city. At the top of the hill, in the densest part of the city, there are multi-story buildings and a church spire. My eyes follow the winding flow of paths that traverse each hill across, over, and around, both rocky and smooth terrain. All paths lead eventually toward the sky above, in the distance, and the shape of the architecture at the top of the farthest hill points us lastly in that direction. We are left to pause at the sky's opening where clouds part and a small section of blue is revealed. Once I've reached the sky, I find myself wandering back to the foreground of the image, looking now more closely at the individual sections and considering the attention with which El Greco has laid small individual strokes to describe each segment of the foliage. He shifts his brush strokes from one tree to the next, moving from short staccato, impasto, rough brushy marks that, with more pigment than binder, to soft blended feathery areas of textured light and shadow. The painting has been described as emotional, theatrical, and dramatic, and standing in front of the work I've always felt as if I might enter this place. El Greco's use of scale and composition gives way to a dynamic experience of looking that parallels our attempts to take in the vastness of a landscape, along with its details, in open air. Observing the painting in person, a viewer is asked to dance between looking up close and from afar in order to gain perspective. We find ourselves with varied impressions of both distanced and detailed views that eventually meld together in our overall experience of the landscape. Today we'll use these elements of scale, light, and composition to construct our own version of a landscape that creates the illusion of depth and perspective. We'll also consider atmosphere, and as we begin our own drawings and paintings of a landscape, I encourage you to consider and name the overall feeling of the place you wish to describe. You might choose El Greco's View of Toledo as a starting point for your subject matter, or you might decide to work from a memory someplace in your imagination, a personal photograph as reference material. If you choose to begin by working from memory, please take a moment to close your eyes and picture the last time you encountered this place that you wish to describe. Consider where you were standing, what time of day it was, what colors you saw, what sounds you heard. Was this place quiet and still, or active and bustling? Take note of any dominant thoughts or ideas, associations or feelings. If you're working from View of Toledo as your starting point or point of inspiration, you might take a moment to write down a few words to describe your overall impression of this place. Mysterious, brooding, distance, lush. I like to begin working with broader ideas, and I often find myself coming back to these ideas as I begin considering elements of scale and composition and light. I'll begin with an overall sketch of this place using larger shapes to map out my composition, how things are arranged on the page. When I'm not quite sure of my composition from the start, I sometimes like to begin with a few thumbnail sketches, small quick studies, that I can use to brainstorm my final iteration. These thumbnail sketches help me to flesh out a variety of ideas before I focus on a larger, more concentrated work. I find that my first idea is not always my best idea, so I like to push myself to experiment with organizing a diverse range of options before I land on my final choice. I try to be playful with this process. The nice part of developing a variety of ideas is that you have alternate images to return to and possibly develop further in future studio sessions. I'll begin now with a few types of landscape compositions and structures. One vertical, one horizontal, one during the day, one at night. Next, I'll choose one of these ideas as I move forward in my painting process. The thumbnail sketch doesn't require many details, so I'll simply focus on large shapes that help me to map out the composition along with light and shadow that will establish shadows and highlights throughout the scene. As you consider building the illusion of perspective in your drawings and paintings, you might note a few easy ways to establish a sense of distance in your work. We can observe El Greco's View of Toledo to establish these strategies. Often, elements that are further in the distance or background of an image tend to appear smaller, darker, and less detailed, while elements in the foreground or front of the image tend to appear larger, lighter, and more specific in the amount of observable details, textures depicted. As you begin developing your own version of a landscape, you might decide to move a building to the foreground and a tree to the background, shifting elements around to create a new place based on the overall atmosphere you wish to describe. As you move these elements, you can keep these ideas of scale, light, and detail in mind in order to maintain the consistency of perspective and depth in your image. For instance, if I were to move one of the large trees in View of Toledo to the background, I might shrink the size of that tree in order to make it appear as if it was receding into the distance, and vice versa for any element I chose to move from background to foreground. In that case, I would enlarge that element as I moved it closer to the front of my painting's composition. I sketch my thumbnail sketches with pencil, but I plan to ultimately sketch the overall composition of my painting with paint. I like to encourage beginning painters to get comfortable using their brush in the same way they might use a pencil. This way you can avoid mixing graphite with pigment and approach purer colors in the final painting. I'll block the overall composition of my drawing with large areas of shape and shadow. You might consider where your light source is coming from before you start assigning shadow to the overall image. In the case of View of Toledo, it feels as if the light emerges mainly in spurts from above between heavily clouded areas. You can explore these ideas with drawing materials or any other form of paint, watercolor, gouache. El Greco used oil paint, but I'll be using drawing materials today, mainly graphite pencil, because I find it easier to clean up and I have it available in my home and studio. I try to work the whole image at once so as to build up the overall scene consistently. Once you've laid out the overall composition and spent time rearranging segments of the scene and adding distinctions between light and shadowed areas, you might consider adding more details with different size marks to the foreground in order to increase the distinction between front and back of the image. Overlapping areas in the foreground on top of the middle ground and background areas also emphasize this distinction and helps to build the illusion of depth in the image. I always like to take a step back from my work while in process and look at it from a distance in order to pay attention to which areas stand out and might need reworking. I'm interested in discovering new ideas along the way and allowing the process to guide me toward more experimentation and ultimately completion. I try to stay open to making changes and taking chances along the way. Once I generally have the overall composition of my sketch laid out, I begin filling in areas of shadow to help to break up the composition and give the viewer ultimately a sense of light versus dark and where that general light source is emerging from. In this case, I'm still allowing for the clouds to show the light shining through a darker sky. So I'm working my way around the image, again building it up generally all at once, trying to keep the overall affect of light and dark even as I work through the general composition of the landscape that I've laid out so far. You'll notice I'm holding my pencil on its side so that I can use the side of the pencil to cover larger areas. Working this way with a pencil gives me a little less control, but also encourages me to think more broadly about the overall composition and to work lightly and loosely as I develop, again, these areas of light and shadow. Next, I'll begin to consider which elements of subject matter I'd like to include in this sketch. And at this point, I'm starting to go back to those broader ideas we brought up at the beginning of the session, where we were thinking through atmosphere, tone, the overall feeling of the place that we wanted to describe. I decided I wanted to add a larger tree in the foreground, and once I'd added that element, I wanted to go back into the overall landscape and add shadow to help to highlight and bring this element closer to the foreground and visibility in the overall image. Once I'd made that section around the tree a little bit darker, I found myself wanting to build up that level of shadow, that level of darkness in the overall image. So once again, I'm continuing to think about this idea of building up the overall landscape all at once, and not just working one section at a time, but really thinking about the whole image growing as a larger experience. Once I'd worked those areas of shadow, that same level of shadow, into the overall image, I again returned to this idea of adding subject matter, and I began thinking about the kinds of foliage we saw in El Greco's work and how I might add an element of texture to the front of the drawing that might convey a sense of something being closer. When we look at things that are closer in an image, we often find that we can see more detail in those elements. And so I wanted to think about using my pencil in a different way for that section on the bottom right of my drawing to help to describe a sense of texture, tactility in a plant that I hadn't really gotten to as I was using the side of my pencil for the majority of the beginning of the drawing. I'll consider to add elements to the foreground to the front of my drawing as I think through what other types of foliage might exist in this place. I'll also begin to add some shadows around these trees, these plants, to help to give a sense of volume to these structures, and also to help place how they exist in this environment. When you add a shadow below or around something, it gives a sense of it sitting in front of or next to another part of this place. I'm also working my way back through this path that I've described, adding shadow to the overall section, and thinking through how this might, again, emphasize the type of light source that I'm describing in this place. Continuing to move through this mountainous range, adding texture, using my pencil on the tip now instead of the side, in order to, again, convey a sort of sense of detail that I hadn't described when I started the overall composition and when I was focusing more primarily on shapes of shadow. At this point in the drawing, now that I have the bulk of the overall composition set up, the structure is set in place, I'm beginning to step back from the drawing and consider how to make the overall image come together. And this involves really thinking through how the light and shadow are set up overall, how these elements of dark and light create balance throughout the way that my eye eventually will move through the image. I'm beginning to think about how I might use the negative space, the space around the clouds or the subject matter in the sky, to create this sense of contrast between light and dark. And this will help the clouds to come forward in the image and for the sky to set back. And I'm also thinking about how I might change the direction of my line as well as I work my way around the sky to create a sense of movement. The way we saw in El Greco's work, I was very inspired by how he used his brushstrokes to think through how to move our eyes through the image. I'll continue to add elements of detail throughout the mountain range, and I'll also use the same idea around negative space, the space around the trees in this case, the subject matter in the foreground or the front of my image, to help to again define these differences between front and back. As I add a darker area around this tree, I'm hoping to help set these two apart, the distance between the tree, the front, and the mountain, the back, whatever is sitting behind that tree. And I'll continue to work my way through the image, thinking about shadow in a slightly different way at this point, adding some medium tones, pressing a little bit more lightly with my pencil, as well as alternating between the side and the tip of my pencil, so I can get at some different kinds of marks as I work my way through the image. I'm coming back to these elements of foliage in the foreground and thinking through how more of a stippling mark, more of a smaller, again, staccato mark might create the sense that we're looking at something more closely, that has more detailed elements that are observable in the front of the landscape. As I begin to darken areas, more areas throughout the image, I continue to think about this idea of balance as I build up the overall sense of light and shadow in the drawing. And I start to consider how I might, again, create these smooth transitions from dark to medium to the light of the page. And so I'm thinking as I work my way through the image about which areas require more attention, where my eye lands, where I want my eyes to go. And I'll use the darker or lighter areas or areas of contrast to help to guide these movements. I'm thinking about, again, adding these dark areas around the clouds and the sky. I'm once again changing the direction of my mark to help to emphasize that movement upward that I was so engrossed by in El Greco's work, thinking through this overall motion of clouds and movement in the sky. After darkening so many areas throughout, I found that some of the foliage in the foreground had gotten lost. And so I found myself wanting to switch again to the tip of my pencil in order to add more structured detail, a harder edge, a thinner line that might again add contrast in a different way. You can add contrast with large areas of light and dark, and you can add contrast with the types of mark that you are assigning to each element in your landscape. So here now I'm going back into the mountain range and thinking about which areas are larger areas of dark, of shadow, and which areas require a little bit more attention in terms of the kind of mark, or in El Greco's case, brushstroke, that you might assign to each element of texture. Once again, I'll continue to consider these areas of transition when part of the image goes from dark to an abrupt light, and whether or not I want that contrast or I'd prefer some kind of smoothness from dark to a medium tone. And I'm returning to the sky to again force this idea of movement by doing what we would call cross-hatching, allowing for some lines in the direction of the lines to create a darker shadow, but also direct the overall motion of the image. As I'm nearing the end of the drawing, I like to once again pick up the work, take a look at it from a distance, and pay attention to where my eyes are moving and any elements that stand out to me that seem like they might need a little bit more attention, whether that's some element of transition, some element of texture or mark making that I'd like to add in order to create more of a balance or a direction throughout the overall image. Here's an example of a finished version of this exploration. I shifted the light source and moved some of the foliage around, as well as edited and removed some of the architecture, so that the focus was even more geared toward the natural elements in the scene. I also made the image horizontal in order to change the way in which your eyes move around the landscape. Once your drawing or painting is complete, we encourage you to share your work with us on social media by using the hashtag #MetSketch. I would also love for you to share your work with friends and family. I always find that feedback is generative in creating future projects. And I've also found that building a community of artists can be incredibly helpful in supporting the encouragement of continued exploration. Again, my name is Jacqueline Cedar, and it was a pleasure sharing El Greco's work and process with you. We hope you'll join us again for another session of virtual drop-in drawing. Please share your work with the hashtag #MetSketch, and we look forward to seeing you all again soon.